This is the third video in the three-part video series on Blueprint YAMLs, and covers load balancer configurations. To handle any external communication to the environment, an AWS Application Load Balancer or Azure Application Gateway is deployed as part of the environment in Colony. For brevity, we'll use the term load balancer to refer to both. The load balancer acts as an entry point to the environment and uses listeners that define the external ports of the environment and the rules that connect them to the environment's applications. In other words, when the Sandbox consumer opens the Sandbox's summary page and clicks an application link, the relevant listener fires and redirects the user to the appropriate application based on the listener's rules. For example, let's say we have a Sandbox environment with 3 applications. Here's the load balancer, and it contains the different listeners of the environment. When a call for HTTP over port 80 comes in, the load balancer checks that listener's rules. This particular listener has 2 rules. The first one redirects to the Nectar API application using a specific path. So Colony checks to see if the Nectar API application's path has an API segment followed by another segment. If the application's path matches the rule's criteria, the rule fires and the connection is made using that path. However, if the application's path is in a different format, the first rule won't fire, and Colony will evaluate the next rule in the listener, which in this case is the default rule. The ingress section of the Blueprint YAML is where you define the listeners and their rules on the load balancer. Let's also define the application. This particular application also requires the use of an artifacts package, so we will need to place the package in the Cloud Accounts Artifacts repository. This repository is defined on the settings page in Colony for the Cloud account. We also need to define the artifacts path in the Blueprint YAML. Note that the path must start with artifacts and a /. Listeners can be of type HTTP or HTTPS, followed by the port and the listener's rules. Here's an example of an HTTP listener that redirects traffic to secure 443 connection. Note that this is a standard pattern that is used in almost all internet websites worldwide, where HTTP calls over port 80 are redirected to secure port 443. And the HTTPS listener in this case redirects the traffic to the Nectar API application. For secure connections, you will also need to set the certificate that resides in a certificate manager on the cloud provider. Let's have a look at the rules that are available for each listener. As we said before, the rules define the application we want to direct the connection to. Please note that each listener's rules are evaluated in their order of appearance. So if the first one doesn't fire, the next one is evaluated, and then the third, and so on, until the load balancer finds a matching rule. Use the path rule if you want to direct traffic to an application that has a specific segment or segments in the URL. For example, if the link points to an API segment, go to an application that has this segment in the URL. The asterisk indicates that the segment is followed by other segments. The host rule redirects calls to applications that have a specific host name. This is used in production environments to redirect calls to the green or blue application, which have different host names. Rules can also use a combination of both path and host. You can also define a default rule for each listener that acts as a fallback if the listener's other rules don't fire. If the default rule is missing and no other rules fire, an error is displayed. Note that the default rule has no conditions and will always fire. Therefore, make sure this rule is placed last after the listener's other rules. The application rule allows you to redirect traffic to a specific application in the environment. So in our case, if the user is trying to reach a URL with the API segment, Colony will redirect the traffic to an application called Nectar API in the environment that has the API segment. And if you define the application rule, you can also use port to redirect traffic to this application over a specific port. Let's open the Nectar API application YAML to take a look. The application port is 3001, which means the Nectar API application must also open this port internally. Since this is an internal port, it is not open to the internet. So if we want to reach this port from the outside, we need to define the appropriate ingress rule on port 443 in the blueprint YAML. In other words, we need to set a rule on the port 443 listener that redirects traffic to port 3001 of the Nectar API application. Note that you cannot have external ports on both the blueprint YAML and application YAML. The best practice is to have the external ports on the blueprint YAML and the internal ports on the application YAML. Use the shortcut rule to customize the application link's display text in the summary page of the sandbox or production environment. If you don't have an ingress section, Colony will create a display link containing the sandbox's public IP address and listener port for the application. Note that the application link will not be displayed if the blueprint YAML has an ingress section but no shortcut. Color is only used for production environments. This rule determines which flavor of the application to access. Note that green rules will result in error if the green instances are not powered on. Like color, the ignore exposure rule is only used for production environments. This rule determines how to redirect traffic between green and blue environments. For example, a value of 0 redirects all blue rules to the blue environment. A value of 50, which only applies to Azure, redirects half of all blue rules to green and the other half to the blue environment. And a value of 100 redirects all blue rules to the green environment. Finally, you can also disable the creation of the environment's load balancer to reduce deployment time and cost. To do so, set the following. This is useful for private deployments where you don't need an entry point to the sandbox. Disabling the load balancer means that each application gets its own IP address and open ports, and that the public health check is disabled. Note that the load balancer is also disabled by default if no application in the environment exposes an external port. This concludes part 3 of the Blueprint YAML series.